Welcome to my channel. Today we delve into one of the most haunting mysteries in aviation history, a story of courage, confusion, and heartbreak that unfolded high above the Indian Ocean. This is the tragic tale of Flight 295, a routine journey that turned into an unimaginable nightmare. For the passengers on board, it began as an ordinary night flight, a calm evening, a smooth climb, and the gentle hum of engines carrying them toward their destination. No one could have imagined that within hours, that same flight would become a desperate struggle against time, fire, and fate itself. The aircraft was a Lockheed L-1011, one of the proud workhorses of the skies, known for its reliability and strength. On this particular night, Flight 295 was heading from Taiwan to South Africa, with a brief stop in Mauritius. On board were families, business travelers, and a seasoned crew who had flown this route countless times. The cabin was filled with soft conversation, the flicker of overhead lights, and the familiar comfort of safety. In the cockpit, Captain David Oos, an experienced pilot with thousands of flight hours, sat beside his first officer and flight engineer. They spoke quietly, monitoring the instruments and discussing the expected weather along their route. The night outside was calm, black sky above, endless water below. Nothing seemed unusual. But somewhere behind the calm, in the dark cargo hold beneath their feet, something was already going terribly wrong. It began silently, a faint whiff of smoke, then the hidden crackle of flames. The cargo bay carried a mix of luggage, mail, and freight, including materials that were never meant to ignite. Fire detection systems back then were primitive compared to modern standards, and by the time the smoke reached the main deck, precious minutes had already passed. A flight attendant noticed the faint smell and reported it to the cockpit. The captain frowned, checking his systems, but the instruments didn't yet confirm any problem. "We'll take a look," he said calmly, unaware that those words marked the start of their final descent into tragedy. Moments later, the alarm sounded. A red light flashed across the instrument panel, cargo fire. The crew snapped into action, their calm replaced by urgent focus. The flight engineer activated the fire suppression system, flooding the lower deck with extinguishing agents. The captain radioed air traffic control in Mauritius, declaring an emergency. His voice was steady, professional. "We have a fire on board. Requesting immediate descent and diversion to Mauritius." The controller responded quickly, clearing airspace and alerting rescue crews. But as the aircraft began its descent, the fire was growing faster than anyone realized. The smoke thickened, seeping through the floor vents into the cabin. Passengers coughed, some panicked, while attendants tried to keep order, covering mouths with wet cloths and helping frightened children breathe. The cabin lights flickered. Somewhere, deep inside the fuselage, something exploded. The cockpit filled with acrid smoke. The crew donned oxygen masks, their voices muffled as they fought to maintain control. "We're losing pressure," the first officer called out. "The fire's spreading forward." The captain could barely see through the haze. He switched to manual controls, his hands steady even as the temperature inside the cabin began to rise. The smell of burning insulation filled the air. Down below, the fire had compromised electrical systems and control cables. The plane was still flying, but barely. "Mayday, Mayday, this is South African Flight 295, the captain said into the radio. "We are declaring a full emergency. Fire in the cargo hold, attempting emergency landing." On the ground, air traffic controllers tried to guide them closer, but communication became erratic. Static filled the line, cutting off words halfway through. 295, confirm your position, the controller said, but the reply came broken, almost ghostly. Losing control, heavy smoke, descending, the radar showed the aircraft turning slightly off course, heading toward open ocean. In the cabin, chaos reigned. Flight attendants shouted instructions over the roar of engines and the crackle of fire. Some passengers prayed aloud. Others clutched loved ones' hands in silence. Oxygen masks hung uselessly for some. Too late, too much smoke. The cabin lights dimmed, replaced by the dull orange glow of fire reflecting through the walls. Inside the cockpit, the situation was desperate. The fire had likely burned through key control lines, leaving the pilots with limited maneuverability. The captain and his crew fought to stabilize the aircraft, every muscle straining. The radio crackled once more. "We are turning back, smoke very bad." It was their final transmission. Minutes later, the radar blip representing Flight 295 vanished over the Indian Ocean. Silence followed, a silence so profound that even the air traffic control center froze, waiting for a voice that never came again. At dawn, the search began. Rescue teams from multiple countries combed the vast ocean, but for hours there was nothing. No debris, no signal, just the endless blue horizon. Then, faintly, floating wreckage was spotted, seat cushions, pieces of fuselage, and twisted metal drifting on the surface. The South African Navy joined the operation, but recovery was nearly impossible. The ocean was deep, the wrecks scattered across miles. Eventually, the cargo door was found, blown outward by force. It told a chilling story. The fire and possibly a mid-air explosion had compromised the structure, opening a section of the plane mid-flight. When investigators finally pieced together the fragments, they uncovered a haunting reality. The fire had started in the main cargo hold, likely fueled by hazardous materials, possibly chemicals or lithium-based products that were not properly declared. Once ignited, it spread uncontrollably. The crew fought valiantly, but the systems failed too quickly. The investigators noted signs that the pilots had stayed at their stations until the very end, trying everything they could to save their passengers. The captain's seatbelt was still fastened, his hand likely on the controls as the plane succumbed to smoke and fire. The final moments of Flight 295 remain among the most tragic in aviation history, a combination of human bravery and human error. Forensic analysis showed that the passengers likely lost consciousness before the final descent, mercifully unaware of the ocean rising beneath them. When the plane hit the water, it disintegrated instantly, leaving behind heartbreak and questions that took years to answer. The story of Flight 295 is more than a technical failure. It's a reminder of the fragility of life and the strength of those who fight until the very end. In those final minutes, surrounded by chaos and fire, a crew held their ground, doing everything possible to protect the souls entrusted to them. Their courage became their legacy. The crash led to major changes in aviation safety, including stricter rules for cargo screening and fire detection systems that now protect millions of travelers every day. Even today, when pilots cross the vast emptiness of the Indian Ocean, they remember Flight 295, the flight that vanished into the dark, carrying with it stories of bravery, love, and loss. And somewhere deep in that endless water, the memory still echoes, a silent testament to those who never made it home. If you found this story moving, consider subscribing to the channel. Every week, we explore real-life aviation mysteries, stories of courage in the skies, and the lessons they leave behind. Thank you for watching, and remember, every flight carries not just passengers, but the hearts and hopes of countless lives below. The night that Flight 295 lifted off from Taiwan was calm, the kind of quiet departure that gives everyone on board a sense of ease. The sky was clear, the winds gentle, and the engines hummed like a steady heartbeat. Passengers settled in, some opening books, others closing their eyes as the city lights faded beneath them. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles, collecting cups, smiling as they prepared for the long journey ahead. There were families on board, business travelers, and crew members who had flown this route many times before. To them, this flight felt routine, just another long haul across the Indian Ocean toward South Africa. But as the plane reached its cruising altitude of 39,000 feet, an invisible danger was already waiting deep within its cargo hold. Beneath the main deck, where the passengers' voices couldn't reach, something sinister stirred. Among the hundreds of bags, parcels, and freight items loaded for the flight, there was something that did not belong, cargo that was improperly declared, possibly hazardous and dangerously unstable. Investigators would later believe that this cargo included chemical materials capable of igniting under specific conditions. The aircraft's smoke detection system, primitive by modern standards, was not built to detect the early stages of such a fire. For now, everything above remained peaceful. The crew chatted quietly, the captain's voice steady over the radio as he checked in with Regional Air Traffic Control. Flight 295 at 390, all systems normal, he said. It was a line he had spoken hundreds of times before, never knowing it would be his last flight report. Inside the cabin, the hours passed slowly. Dinner was served, lights dimmed, and passengers drifted into sleep. Outside, the world was silent except for the steady roar of the engines, carrying the aircraft through the vast darkness above the ocean. The moonlight reflected faintly on the wings, glinting off the polished surface of the L-1011. It was a perfect night for flying, calm and uneventful, or so it seemed. But deep below, a faint smoke began to form. It started small, barely visible, almost innocent. It curled around a corner of a shipping container, feeding on oxygen and warmth, finding life in the shadows of complacency. There was no alarm, no warning yet, only the quiet birth of a nightmare. In the cockpit, Captain David Oos was relaxed but attentive. He was known among his peers as calm under pressure, the kind of man who never raised his voice and never lost control. His first officer, a young but skilled pilot, was reviewing charts while the flight engineer monitored fuel and electrical systems. Routine filled their world, and silence was comfort. "Coffee?" the flight attendant asked, smiling as she entered the cockpit. The captain nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Sure, thank you." That simple act, that tiny moment of normalcy, would be one of the last peaceful exchanges on that flight. It began with a smell. Somewhere in the rear of the cabin, a passenger stirred and sniffed the air, wrinkling his nose. It smelled faintly of something burning, plastic, maybe, or wiring. He glanced around but saw nothing unusual. He pressed his call button, and a flight attendant appeared moments later. "Ma'am," he said softly, "do you smell that?" She frowned, sniffed, and caught it too, a faint but sharp scent of smoke. She moved toward the rear galley, checking ovens and electrical outlet. Everything seemed fine, but the smell lingered. She picked up the interphone and called the cockpit. "Captain, this is Flight Attendant Lucy. We may have a small electrical smell in the aft cabin. Could you check systems?" The captain acknowledged calmly, instructing the engineer to verify the circuit panels. Everything appeared normal. "We'll monitor," he replied. The attendant hung up, unaware that those two words would soon carry unbearable weight. Minutes later, the situation escalated. The faint smell became stronger, sharper. A thin haze began to form near the rear galley, subtle at first but unmistakable to those who looked closely. A second flight attendant opened the service compartment, only to see smoke curling up from below the floor vent. Panic flickered in her eyes as she called out, "Fire! There's smoke!" Instantly, the crew sprang into action. Fire extinguishers were retrieved, passengers stirred awake, and the interphone buzzed again. "Captain, we have visible smoke." The cockpit fell silent for a moment, then the captain's voice came firm and low. "Understood. Initiating procedures." The engineer flipped switches, activating the fire suppression system for the cargo bay. A dense gas, halon, was released below deck to smother the flames. But this system had limitations. It could slow a fire, not stop it entirely, especially if the blaze was fueled by chemicals or flammable materials. The captain declared an emergency. "Mayday, mayday, mayday, this is South African Flight 295. We have a fire on board. Requesting immediate descent and diversion to Mauritius." The calm tone in his voice masked the storm rising in his chest. The controller responded quickly. "Flight 295, roger. Descend to flight level 250. Turn heading 220. Mauritius is expecting you." As the aircraft began its descent, the cabin turned chaotic. Passengers coughed as smoke thickened, filling the air with a choking haze. The lights flickered, and the smell of burning plastic and rubber grew unbearable. Flight attendants tried to calm everyone, shouting instructions through the darkness. "Stay seated. Cover your faces." One of them soaked towels in water bottles, handing them to passengers to breathe through. Children cried, oxygen masks dangled from the ceiling, and fear spread like wildfire through the aisles. The once silent night sky now echoed with muffled screams and the desperate prayers of 200 souls trapped above the ocean. In the cockpit, visibility was fading fast. Smoke seeped through the ventilation system, blurring the instrument panel. The pilots wore oxygen masks, their breathing heavy through the microphones. The flight engineer struggled to maintain power, his hands moving across the controls like a pianist playing a desperate song. "We're losing electrical systems," he shouted. "Left engine temperature rising." The captain gripped the yoke tightly, his knuckles white. "Keep her steady," he said, his voice cracking for the first time. They could barely see outside, only a faint shimmer of moonlight on the horizon. Below them, the ocean stretched endlessly, cold and indifferent. Then came a loud bang, an explosion from below the deck. The entire aircraft jolted violently. Luggage tumbled from overhead bins, and passengers screamed as the plane shuddered. The fire had likely breached the cargo floor, reaching wiring and control lines. "We've lost hydraulics," the first officer shouted. "Controls sluggish." The captain fought to keep the nose level. "We have to get her down," he said. He radioed again, but the response was faint through static. 295, say again, losing you, repeat, the connection broke. The fire continued to consume everything in its path. Flames licked through the floor, searing metal, melting insulation, devouring oxygen. The cockpit grew hotter, smoke thicker. The captain made one last attempt to stabilize, lowering the nose slightly to maintain airspeed. "Brace for impact," he said quietly to his crew. But the passengers never heard him. They were already unconscious from smoke inhalation, mercifully unaware of what was coming next. At 3:10 a.m., radar contact with Flight 295 was lost. The sky above the Indian Ocean was empty again, silent and still. For those on the ground, the night continued peacefully, unaware that in the dark expanse above, hundreds of lives had just been extinguished. It would be hours before anyone knew what had happened, before ships would search, before headlines would scream, before families would realize their loved ones would never return. And somewhere, deep beneath the waves, the wreckage of Flight 295 settled on the ocean floor, its cargo door torn open, its final moments frozen in silence. The story of what happened next would take years to uncover, and the truth, when it came, would change aviation forever. But in that endless night, one thing was certain. The crew of Flight 295 had fought until the very end, trapped above the ocean, refusing to give up until there was nothing left to fight for. Morning broke over the Indian Ocean in haunting silence. The sun's golden light spilled across a sea that looked calm, peaceful, endless, betraying no sign of the horror that had unfolded hours earlier. For the air traffic controllers in Mauritius, the night had ended with confusion, disbelief, and heartbreak. Flight 295 had vanished from their radar screens at exactly 3:10 a.m., its signal blinking out with no distress call, no final transmission, no trace. They had called again and again into the void, "South African Flight 295, do you read?" But the only answer was static, the kind of silence that feels alive, like the ocean itself was swallowing the truth. Within minutes, emergency protocols were launched. Search and rescue teams scrambled. Ships were dispatched from nearby ports, aircraft were deployed from South Africa, and the world waited anxiously for any word of survivors. As the hours passed, hope began to fade. The first pieces of wreckage were found floating on the surface of the Indian Ocean, seat cushions, bits of luggage, fragments of insulation. Some items were burned, melted, warped by unimaginable heat. A few hours later, Oil slicks began to appear on the water's surface, marking the area where the aircraft had likely gone down. The crew of a passing freighter radioed in, confirming the unthinkable. Debris was everywhere. But there were no signs of life. No raft. No movement. Only the shattered remnants of what had once been a living, breathing machine filled with people and dreams. By the next morning, the entire world knew. News broke across every major network. South African Airways Flight 295 missing, feared lost over the Indian Ocean. Families gathered in airports, clutching photos of loved ones, their faces pale with disbelief. Reporters swarmed terminals, demanding answers, but there were none. At the South African Airways headquarters, officials worked frantically, confirming passenger lists, reviewing maintenance logs, and coordinating with investigators. The words that no one wanted to hear soon became official: there were no survivors. Every single person aboard had perished. The entire nation of South Africa fell into mourning, its people grieving not just a tragedy, but a mystery. For weeks, the search continued. Ships dragged sonar equipment across the deep waters, mapping the ocean floor. Planes flew overhead, scanning for more debris. What they found painted a picture of catastrophe. The aircraft had disintegrated upon impact, scattering wreckage across a wide area. But the real mystery lay beneath. What had caused the crash? Was it an explosion? A mechanical failure? Or something else, something darker? Investigators needed the flight recorders, the black boxes, but retrieving them from the depths of the Indian Ocean would take time, technology, and courage. The wreck lay more than 15,000 feet below the surface, a world of darkness and silence that few had ever reached. Months later, after countless attempts, a joint recovery mission succeeded in locating part of the fuselage on the seabed. Among the twisted metal and scattered debris, searchers found a single, fragile clue: the rear cargo door, torn apart, bent outward, its hinges warped as if blasted by force from within. It was evidence that something catastrophic had happened midair, long before the plane hit the water. The theory of a cargo fire now became the central focus. But there was a problem. No one knew exactly what had been loaded in the cargo hold that night. The manifest was incomplete, vague, filled with general terms like electronic parts, textiles, and miscellaneous goods. Somewhere in that mix, investigators suspected, was something that had burned uncontrollably, something that was never supposed to be there. When the black boxes were finally recovered, investigators listened to the last 30 minutes of the cockpit voice recorder with heavy hearts. The recording was faint, distorted by pressure damage, but fragments of conversation could still be heard. The captain's calm voice gave way to tension. "We have smoke," he said. A few minutes later, "Fire in the hold, we're descending." Then, the sound of coughing, alarms, confusion. Voices shouting orders. A sudden burst of static, followed by silence. The final word captured was the captain's, Mauritius, his voice trailing off as the recording ended abruptly. It was not just data. It was a man's last breath, echoing in a dark room years later, surrounded by investigators who sat in silence, listening to the ghosts of Flight 295. Further analysis of the flight data recorder revealed that the plane had remained structurally intact until the final moments, meaning it had not exploded midair. Instead, the fire likely compromised the aircraft's systems one by one, leading to a loss of control. Investigators reconstructed the timeline. A fire started in the cargo hold, spreading rapidly. Smoke filled the cabin, forcing the pilots to don masks. The heat damaged control cables and hydraulic lines. The crew attempted to descend and divert. Communication became intermittent, and finally, control was lost. The plane entered a steep descent, disappearing from radar before crashing into the Indian Ocean at high speed. It was over in seconds. But what caused the fire? That question would haunt the investigation for years. Some experts pointed to improperly packed chemical cargo, materials capable of spontaneous combustion when exposed to heat or vibration. Others believed the fire might have been fueled by flammable liquids leaking from a shipment. There were even theories of lithium batteries, long before their dangers were widely known. In the end, the official cause was listed simply as cargo fire of unknown origin. It was a technical term, but behind it lay human error, an oversight that cost hundreds of lives. The emotional toll of the investigation was enormous. For families, the lack of answers was unbearable. Mothers, fathers, children, all searching for meaning in an ocean that refused to give up its secrets. At memorial services, candles were lit, names read aloud, and prayers whispered into the wind. Survivors' families held onto the belief that their loved ones had not suffered, that they had lost consciousness before the crash, that their final moments were peaceful. But for those who knew aviation, the truth was harder to face. The crew had fought until the very end, trapped in a cockpit filled with fire and smoke, trying to save lives even as their own slipped away. The story of Flight 295 reshaped aviation forever. New safety standards were implemented for cargo screening, including stricter labeling of dangerous goods and the introduction of advanced smoke detection and fire suppression systems. Pilots were trained for new emergency scenarios, and aircraft design evolved to prevent such tragedies from repeating. But the ocean never gave up all its answers. To this day, parts of Flight 295 remain buried in darkness, sealed beneath miles of water, a silent tomb holding the truth of that terrible night. Years later, one of the investigators would describe it best. Standing before a memorial, he said, "When you look at that ocean, you see peace. But beneath it lies the memory of courage, the courage of a crew who refused to surrender, and of passengers who trusted them until their final breath." The legacy of Flight 295 lives on not as a tale of failure, but of humanity's unyielding will to learn, to protect, and to remember. Every time a pilot calls Mayday, every time a crew member smells smoke and reacts without hesitation, they carry a piece of that flight's lesson with them. For in the darkness of that night above the Indian Ocean, amid the fire and fear, something remarkable shone through, the human spirit refusing to die quietly. In the months following the tragedy of Flight 295, the grief that hung over South Africa, Mauritius, and the aviation world deepened into something heavier: determination. The investigation had already revealed fragments of truth, yet those fragments refused to fit together neatly. For the families, the loss was still fresh. Every day, they watched news anchors repeat the same haunting words: a fire of unknown origin. It wasn't enough. How could a modern jetliner, flown by skilled professionals, simply vanish into the sea with no clear explanation? The question lingered like smoke in the air. Behind closed doors, investigators worked tirelessly, combing through wreckage retrieved from the depths of the Indian Ocean, analyzing charred pieces of metal, wiring, and fabric. What they found told a story of unimaginable heat and destruction. Heat so intense that parts of the fuselage had melted together, and fragments of the cargo bay were fused into twisted sculptures of aluminum and ash. The main piece of wreckage they recovered was part of the rear fuselage, specifically the section near the cargo compartment. It was here that investigators focused their attention. The evidence suggested that the fire had started low, then burned upward with terrifying speed, consuming everything in its path. Soot trails on the inner walls pointed toward an origin near a set of cargo pallet. They found remnants of plastic containers, fragments of charred cardboard, and metal drums warped by heat. None of it could be identified with certainty, but tests indicated traces of phosphorus and magnesium, materials capable of igniting spontaneously under the right conditions. Such items were banned from air transport unless properly declared, but someone, somewhere, had ignored those rules. The fire was not an accident of nature, it was born from negligence. Meanwhile, divers continued their descent into the abyss in search of more wreckage. The site was one of the deepest recovery operations in history, a place where light could not reach and pressure crushed metal like paper. Remote submersibles sent back ghostly images of debris scattered across the ocean floor, engines, landing gear, pieces of the tail, and, most hauntingly, the outline of the main fuselage, now resting in eternal silence. Seeing it stirred something inside every rescuer who watched the footage. Each piece pulled from the depths was not just evidence, it was a fragment of a story that had ended too soon. The divers treated every find with reverence, knowing that each item once shared the sky with 200 souls. In South Africa, Captain David Oos and his crew were mourned as heroes. The public came to know his face, his calm demeanor, his reputation for composure under pressure. He was no longer just a pilot, he was a symbol of courage. His wife, in a quiet press statement, said, "He lived for the sky. And if he had to die, I know he died trying to save others." Those words echoed across newspapers, television, and radio. At memorial services, candles flickered in rows, casting soft light across photographs of smiling passengers who would never return. Children held flowers they could barely carry. The choir sang softly, their voices trembling through tears. The President of South Africa sent condolences, calling it a tragedy that binds our hearts in shared sorrow. The investigation, however, continued to peel away layers of mystery. One discovery shocked even the most seasoned expert. The recovered cargo door, the massive, heavy panel at the side of the fuselage, had been blown outward, not inward. This indicated that a powerful internal explosion or pressure buildup had occurred before the crash. Some investigators speculated that the fire had caused combustible materials in the cargo bay to rupture violently, leading to a structural failure midair. That failure could have depressurized the cabin instantly, making it impossible for the crew to control the aircraft. The theory gained weight as more evidence surfaced. Signs of scorching around the frame, metal fatigue consistent with rapid decompression, and traces of soot on the outer surface of the door. It wasn't just fire, it was chaos tearing the aircraft apart piece by piece. In a somber briefing to the press, the lead investigator summarized their findings. The fire was catastrophic, uncontrollable, and likely intensified by materials not listed on the manifest. The crew fought valiantly, but the systems failed faster than they could respond. This was not a matter of poor piloting, it was a matter of impossible odds. Those words offered some comfort, but not closure. The families wanted accountability. They wanted to know who had allowed that cargo on board. Investigators traced shipping documents back to multiple companies, but the trail was murky. Labels had been changed, records lost, names missing. In the end, no one was ever held directly responsible. The fire's origin was classified as undetermined, a phrase that, while technically accurate, felt cruelly hollow to those left behind. The aftermath of the tragedy sent ripples through the aviation world. Governments and airlines around the globe re-examined their cargo policies, realizing that the very same kind of oversight could happen anywhere. New rules were enforced. Stricter cargo inspections, mandatory fire-resistant containers, and enhanced smoke detection systems for all commercial aircraft. Pilots underwent new training programs on in-flight fire procedures. Every passenger flight from that day forward would benefit from those changes, born from the lessons of Flight 295. The crew's sacrifice had not been in vain, it had rewritten the rules of aviation safety. Still, for the families, life never returned to normal. They gathered every year at the memorial built overlooking the ocean near Mauritius, a simple monument engraved with the names of all on board. Each name represented a story, a heartbeat, a voice that once laughed or dreamed. Some families brought letters, tossing them into the wave. Others stood in silence, staring out at the horizon where the plane had disappeared, as if waiting for it to reappear from the clouds one last time. The sea was calm each year, as if it, too, remembered. Decades later, the story of Flight 295 remains both tragedy and lesson. Aviation students still study it, engineers still reference it, and safety officers still invoke it when training crews. Its legacy lives on in every reinforced cargo hold, every improved detection system, every emergency procedure that saves lives today. The fire that destroyed one aircraft became the light that guided future generations toward safer skies. And yet, there are moments, quiet, reflective moments, when the ocean feels heavier, as though it still holds secrets it refuses to share. Somewhere, miles beneath the surface, the wreckage of Flight 295 rests undisturbed, the cargo hold sealed in eternal silence. The captain's seat remains fastened. The controls, now corroded, still face forward. The ocean has claimed their bodies, but their story continues to rise, carried not by waves, but by remembrance. Flight 295 is not just the story of a disaster, it is the story of human resolve, of those who faced the unthinkable and fought until the end. Above the Indian Ocean, in the darkest hours before dawn, courage burned brighter than fire. And though the night claimed the aircraft, it could not extinguish the spirit of those who dared to fight it. Their final act was not one of despair, but defiance, a refusal to surrender even when trapped above the endless sea. The tragedy of Flight 295 was supposed to fade with time. Investigators closed their files, the media moved on, and the world resumed its rhythm of departures and arrivals. Yet for those who had lost loved ones, time did not heal, it simply layered memory over pain. In the years that followed, the story of Flight 295 became more than an accident report. It became a haunting whisper in aviation circles, a case study in courage and mystery. Pilots who heard it often fell silent, their eyes distant, imagining themselves in that cockpit, surrounded by smoke, fighting an unwinnable battle against the fire. For the families, anniversaries brought more than remembrance. They brought questions, the kind that never stopped echoing. Why was that cargo allowed on board? Why didn't the alarms sound sooner? Could someone, anyone, have survived? The final official report did not bring peace. It confirmed what many already knew. A catastrophic in-flight fire, origin unknown, began in the main cargo compartment. The crew fought bravely, descending toward Mauritius in a desperate attempt to save their passengers. But the fire had burned through crucial systems and control lines, rendering the plane nearly impossible to manage. It was a statement written in sterile technical language, but between those lines lived a story far too human to reduce to numbers and diagrams. The pilots' oxygen masks, recovered from the wreckage, still bore traces of smoke and soot, proof that they had continued to breathe and fight long after the fire became uncontrollable. Their courage had been unmatched. Behind closed doors, the flight community mourned them in their own quiet way. Airline captains around the world read transcripts of the final moments, studying them in simulator sessions, trying to understand how to avoid repeating their fate. In crew lounges and training centers, Flight 295 became a lesson taught not from theory, but from humanity. You can't always win, one instructor would say, but you can always fight until the end. Those words echoed the unspoken truth behind every flight, that the sky is beautiful, but it is never merciful. For the families, each year's memorial became both a wound and a blessing. In South Africa, the site at Helderberg Memorial Park, named after the aircraft, the Helderberg became sacred ground. Flowers, faded photos, and handwritten notes covered the marble walls etched with names. Mothers left toys for children who had never come home. Elderly parents stood silently, touching the carved letters of their sons' and daughters' names. The ocean wind carried their whispers toward the horizon. Reporters still attended every few years, their cameras rolling, but they spoke softer now, as if in reverence. The story was no longer breaking news. It had become history. Still, some refused to let go of the mystery. Independent investigators, aviation enthusiasts, and even former crew members began to question whether the entire truth had been told. Rumors circulated about undeclared military cargo, or even chemical materials being transported in secret. Some believed that the government knew more than it revealed, citing the missing details in the cargo manifest and inconsistencies in the report. It wasn't proof, just speculation, but it gave the story an edge of darkness that kept it alive in public imagination. To this day, those theories remain unproven, buried under decades of silence. But what no one disputed was the courage shown by the crew and passengers in those final minutes. Recovered wreckage told its own tale. The cockpit door, though burned and twisted, showed signs that it had remained closed, meaning the pilots had stayed at their posts until the very end. The layout of debris suggested that even as systems failed and visibility dropped to zero, the captain and his team continued to fight to control the descent. Forensic analysis indicated that the aircraft hit the ocean at a relatively stable attitude, not a steep dive, but a controlled angle. That fact alone proved that the crew never surrendered to panic. They guided the aircraft as best they could, even as fire consumed it from within. It was not a crash born of fear. It was a landing attempted in the face of death. In the years that followed, aviation changed. Governments worldwide implemented new regulations, inspired by the lessons of Flight 295. Cargo holds were redesigned to include stronger fireproof barriers and early warning smoke detectors. The FAA and ICAO mandated more advanced fire suppression systems capable of cutting off oxygen completely. Dangerous goods were subject to stricter oversight. The tragedy forced the world to look hard at how complacency and paperwork could become killers at 39,000 feet. Out of the ashes of that night, safety rose, quietly, steadily, shaped by the memory of those lost. Yet even with progress, the emotional weight of the story endured. Survivors' families often described feeling torn between gratitude and sorrow, thankful that others would live because of their loss, yet crushed by the knowledge that their loved ones' deaths had been the price. One mother, interviewed decades later, said softly, "When I see a plane take off, I feel proud. Because I know somewhere inside it are the lessons my son died to teach." Her words captured what the official reports never could, the profound humanity behind every tragedy. Captain David Usa's name became legend among aviators. His calm, his composure, and his bravery under impossible conditions became an example passed down through generations of pilots. They said he embodied the spirit of aviation itself, the duty to bring others home, no matter the cost. On the anniversary of the crash, fellow pilots across the world flew with black ribbons pinned to their uniforms. For them, it wasn't just a gesture, it was a vow to remember. But perhaps the most haunting part of Flight 295's legacy was what lay beneath the surface of the ocean, in that cold, dark world where no light could reach. The wreckage remained undisturbed, preserved by depth and pressure, silent but unbroken. Occasionally, expeditions were proposed to retrieve more pieces, but most were abandoned due to the immense cost and risk. The ocean kept its secret well. Down there, surrounded by silence, the remains of the Helderberg rested like a monument carved by tragedy, a reminder that human technology, no matter how advanced, still bows before nature. Still, despite the unanswered questions, one truth stood clear and unchallenged. No one on that plane gave up. Every passenger, every crew member, fought in their own way, some praying, some helping others, some simply holding hands in the dark. In their final moments, they became a family united by fear, hope, and courage. The crew in the cockpit, blinded by smoke, never abandoned their posts. The flight attendants in the cabin, choking on fumes, still tried to calm the passengers. Even as the aircraft fell from the sky, humanity held its ground against chaos. The legend of Flight 295 is not about how it fell, it is about how it was flown, how it was fought for, and how it refused to surrender until the very last second. That is what makes it unforgettable. Above the Indian Ocean, on that long night in 1987, when the fire raged and systems failed, the people aboard the Helderberg wrote their names not in reports or records, but in history. Their story continues to live in every safe landing that follows, in every pilot who checks a warning light twice, in every flight attendant who learns how to spot smoke before it spreads, and in every passenger who closes their eyes in trust as a plane climbs into the clouds. The tragedy that once shattered hearts now guards them. Flight 295 may have disappeared into the Indian Ocean, but its voice still echoes in the hum of every jet engine and the steady rhythm of every captain's heartbeat, reminding us that even when surrounded by darkness, courage still finds a way to fly. Decades have passed since the night Flight 295 vanished into the Indian Ocean, yet its story refuses to sink. The world remembers it not just as another air disaster, but as a haunting testament to bravery, failure, and the price of human oversight. For those who lived through its aftermath, the tragedy never ended, it only changed shape. Families who once stood at airports clutching photographs now visit memorials carved in marble. Investigators who once sifted through wreckage now teach young aviators about lessons written in loss. The crew of the Helderberg may have disappeared beneath the waves, but their courage echoes through every emergency checklist, every training manual, every cockpit where a pilot's hand hesitates for a fraction of a second before making a choice. The memorial near Mauritius still stands on a quiet bluff overlooking the sea. It's simple, a curved wall bearing the names of all 259 souls who perished that night. Each name catches the sunlight for just a moment before the waves below reclaim it in reflection. Families gather there every year on the anniversary, bringing flowers, photographs, and letters that the wind scatters across the ocean. Some speak aloud, as if the sea can still hear them. Others stand in silence, their faces carved by time but their eyes filled with the same grief. The air smells of salt and memory. In the distance, aircraft still trace their paths through the clouds, silver against the blue, like distant ghosts crossing the same sky where Flight 295 was last seen. The final investigation report, released years after endless speculation, did not end the questions. It confirmed that the fire began in the main cargo compartment, but the cause remained undetermined. Those words, cold and unsatisfying, left behind an ache that science could not heal. Some said it was spontaneous combustion, others whispered about undeclared hazardous cargo or misdeclared military materials. The theories multiplied, fueled by the secrecy of governments and the gaps in the manifest. There were whispers that certain items were removed from the official list before publication. Others believed that the fire suppression system had failed long before the first alarm sounded. To the families, it no longer mattered what the details were. What mattered was that no one had stopped it before it happened. But while mystery shrouded the cause, one truth became undeniable. The bravery of the people aboard the Helderberg changed aviation forever. In the aftermath of the crash, airlines across the world were forced to re-examine how they carried cargo. Regulators tightened rules, banning certain chemicals from passenger flights entirely. New heat sensors and smoke detectors were installed in every commercial jetliner. Fire-resistant containers became mandatory, and crew training shifted from theory to survival realism. The darkness that claimed Flight 295 brought light to thousands of future flights. Every time a pilot now calls out "smoke warning," "verify source," a quiet echo of that night lives in their voice. The ghosts of the Helderberg still guide the skies. For Captain David Oos and his crew, their final actions became the very definition of heroism. Audio recovered from the cockpit's final minutes revealed a crew working with calm precision, fighting until their last breath. The captain's voice, steady even as alarms wailed, spoke of resolve, not fear. "We'll make it to Mauritius," he had said. They never did, but the effort mattered. The oxygen masks recovered from the cockpit bore fingerprints, proof that they had remained at their stations until the end. Pilots who studied that recording later said they felt a chill down their spines. The realization that professional duty and human courage could coexist even when death was certain. It was not just flying skill, it was something deeper. It was faith in themselves, in each other, and in the sky they served. As years passed, documentaries, books, and films revisited the story, each trying to capture what no photograph ever could: the fear, the smoke, the weight of those final moments. In every retelling there was always the same refrain: how calm they were, how steadfast, how the passengers, trapped and gasping for air, must have looked to the flight attendants for reassurance, and found it, even in the face of the impossible. The human side of the story became its most powerful legacy. When modern cabin crews train today, they study what happened aboard Flight 295. Not the instruments, not the flames, but the people, the teamwork, the unspoken courage of strangers facing fate together. In South Africa, the tragedy reshaped a generation. It was more than a crash, it was a wound to a nation that prided itself on its aviation excellence. The airline's flag carried a shadow for years, every flight carrying a quiet reminder of what had been lost. The name Helderberg became sacred. It was never used again for another aircraft. The crew's portraits were hung in training halls, where new pilots still pause before takeoff to read their names. For them, Flight 295 is not just a story from history. It's a reminder of what it means to hold lives in your hands and to never let fear dictate your final choice. There are still those who cannot let go of the mystery. Independent investigators and journalists continue to dive into archives, tracing shipping logs, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing long-forgotten reports. Every few years, new theories emerge: claims of suppressed evidence, government cover-ups, or chemical shipments disguised as cargo. But even if the truth remains buried, one fact endures above all else. The men and women aboard that flight faced a nightmare no training could prepare them for, and they met it with grace and courage until their final breath. In the end, their story became larger than the mystery. It became a parable of strength, of what it means to remain human even when trapped above the ocean, surrounded by fire and fear. Today, when pilots fly over the coordinates where Flight 295 went down, some still glance at the radar screen for a heartbeat longer. It's not superstition, it's respect. Somewhere beneath them, in the black depths of the ocean, rests the Helderberg, its fuselage now a coral-covered monument to those who refused to surrender. The sea that once devoured it now guards it in silence. Scientists say the wreck lies perfectly still, the cockpit intact, the controls frozen mid-turn, as if the crew is still there, still fighting, still guiding their plane toward home. And maybe, in some way, they are. Because Flight 295's legacy lives in the air itself, in every pilot who double-checks a warning light, in every crew member who rushes toward danger instead of away from it, in every passenger who steps onto a plane without fear because others once paid the ultimate price for that safety. Their sacrifice was not in vain. It became the unseen hand that keeps modern flight alive. The ocean may never give up the final truth, but it has given something greater: remembrance. The kind that cannot be erased by time or silence. When the wind sweeps across the Indian Ocean on clear nights, it's said you can almost hear the faint hum of engines, a whisper carried on the tide. Perhaps it's only imagination. Or perhaps it's the sound of the Helderberg, still flying somewhere beyond the horizon, carrying with it the courage of every soul who refused to let fear win. And as we remember them, let this story be more than tragedy. Let it be a tribute to the crew who stood their ground, to the passengers who held on to hope, and to the unseen guardians of the sky who remind us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to face it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that even in the darkest moments humanity still shines, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Here we honor the real stories that shaped the skies, the voices, the heroes, and the lessons that keep us safe above the clouds. Thank you for watching, and may we never forget the souls of Flight 295, the ones who fought the fire, faced the darkness, and still found the strength to fly into eternity.